do you remember when it was considered not just impolitic, but an example of mal, and misinformation to even mention the presence of neo-Nazis within the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian society?
I do.
This was not long ago. I mean, it still is, but everybody now has to face a disturbing reality, which was conveyed not by the Putin puppets at the Grayzone, but by the Financial Times. This is Ottawa University professor Ivan Kachanovsky on a recent Financial Times feature, which declares in no uncertain terms that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. Biden administration is aware that its strategy is not sustainable. We are losing the war, say U.S. officials. And they were unimpressed by Zelensky's victory plan, which, by the way, is not a victory plan. It is a plan to generate pressure on Russia to give Ukraine a more favorable bargaining position because negotiations seem inevitable. And they're, talking internally in the Biden administration in a more pragmatic tone on land for security negotiations. But here's the key part. If you get into any negotiation, it could be a trigger for social instability, says a Ukrainian official. Zelensky knows this very well. I wonder if they're talking to Andrei Yermak there, who kind of controls Zelensky. There will always be a radical segment of Ukrainian society that will call any negotiation capitulation. The far right in Ukraine is growing. The right wing is a danger to democracy, says Morezko, who's a member of parliament for Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, which could probably be renamed Servant of the Azov Battalion Party. So, Aaron, do you feel vindicated?
Well, I mean, we've just been saying this forever. There have been so many opportunities for peace to avoid Russia's invasion. There's the Minsk Accords, which whenever Zelensky tried to take a step towards implementing it, tens of thousands of members of these far-right movements would rally, and their slogan was "No to capitulation." And when he took even minimal steps to implement the Minsk Accords, he faced resistance from the very forces that this member of his party is now warning about. But again, if you're in the media and you say this truth, you get accused of spreading Russian propaganda and all that. And now that a member of Zelensky's party said it, he's received basically a rebuke from members of the Azov Battalion who said, like, what are you talking about? Even though he didn't even mention Azov by name, Azov knows that they're talking about them. And that was a very courageous thing for him to say, because it's the thing you're not allowed to say. I mean, now you can't even say it in the US. So imagine how it is in Ukraine, that kind of climate. But yeah, I mean, that's what that member of parliament says there from Zelensky's party is exactly what we've been saying forever. And it's obvious. Everyone knows it. It's like the dirty little secret you're not allowed to mention. And why? Because these people don't recognize the equality of ethnic Russians in Ukraine and don't want to grant them their rights. They want to continue the program they began after taking power in the 2014 Maidan coup of basically assaulting Russian culture and not recognizing it as Ukrainian. Their conception of Ukrainian is Banderite. It's based on, anti-Semitism and Russophobia. And they don't want to recognize the equality of people who don't share that ethnic background and that agenda. So that's what all this remains to be about. And that's the side the U.S. has taken, just as it does everywhere. It always takes the side of extremists, ultranationalists, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's the insurgency in Syria, which was dominated by Al-Qaeda, or Ukraine, where, again, to achieve its goals of undermining an adversary, it has to take the side of the most aggressive ultranationalists, because that's who has the weaponry and the ideological motivation to fight a war, which didn't need to be fought.
It never needed to be fought. If negotiations had taken place in April 2022 that weren't sabotaged by Boris Johnson and company, Ukraine would be in a much better negotiating position than it's currently in, and that it will be whenever lands for security is negotiated. And we're in a similar situation in Ukraine, where the U.S. has invested so much militarily and politically, as the U.S. is in Israel, where if there's a ceasefire in Israel, there is a portion, an incipient movement in that society, the religious nationalist Third Temple movement, that is going to seek to spark a civil war. And you have the same scenario in Ukraine as the Financial Times now acknowledges, something we've been saying for years. And this really, it highlights the contradiction within the concept of US proxies. They never actually function as reliable proxies because their own societies are so fundamentally unstable. So it's hard to see how this will end up without Zelensky potentially being evacuated to a condo in Miami next door to Yair Netanyahu.
Yeah, and it doesn't look like Zelensky's going to get his request from Biden, which is like his only real component of the so-called victory plan, which is permission to use U.S. weapons for long-range strikes. There's an article in the New York Times about a week ago saying that U.S. intelligence is against it, which either is a sign that they're trying to undermine Biden if he's leaning towards approving Zelensky, or it's a sign that Zelensky's not going to get what he asked for because they're putting this out to sort of preview Biden's decision that he's not going to give Zelensky permission, because they point out it would be dangerous because Putin threatened retaliation against NATO, and also it would be useless because Russia's already moved its major military assets out of range anyway. So the one thing that Zelensky was hoping to get, the one card left, it doesn't look right now as if he's going to get it. Although again, with Joe Biden, you can never rule it out because he's a devout warmonger. But for Zelensky, things are not looking good as anybody could have predicted. And no matter who wins the election, obviously he'd prefer if it's Kamala Harris, because Kamala Harris is part of the administration that is waging this proxy war. But no matter what happens, it just, Zelensky has been a disaster. And by rejecting the peace deal that his own negotiators reached early on into the invasion, he's put himself and his country in a really perilous state.
And by embracing civil war, Zelensky has lost his constituency. He was elected by many Russian speakers from the East who are no longer part of Ukraine, and he's waging war on them.
Yeah.
So there is no real Zelensky as a democratic leader. He's totally dependent on the nationalist forces and the U.S. now.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time before.
Yeah, and as this member of his party pointed out, he's also scared of them too. He's aligned with them, but also boxed in by them, because if he does anything to move toward peace, then he could be overthrown, as they've openly threatened to do. And so as long as the Biden administration doesn't have any interest in diplomacy, someone like Zelensky will be totally boxed in, unable to do anything, totally impotent because of his own choices.